After Brexit, Brussels feeling the blowback against globalization in its own backyard. Belgium's French-speaking Wallonia region so far saying non to the free trade deal the EU was to have approved with Canada this week. Consensus in short supply these days when it comes to open markets. And after Brexit, Wallonia is another example of a Rust Belt economy blowing back against globalization. In the grand scheme, trade agreements with Canada may seem, well, a bit, how should we say it, arcane. But that's the point, says the Canadian Prime Minister. If they can't agree on this, Justin Trudeau insists, what can they agree on? Is it the credibility of the whole continent that's at stake? One single region holding sway over 28 nations, soon to be 27. What is the alternative to rule by consensus? What happens when you go down the British path and go your own way? Today in the France 24 debate, is the EU project in fact in the balance? We'll be joined from La Louvière in Belgium by the Vice President of Wallonia's Regional Senate Socialist, Olga Zrian. Joining us here in the studio, John Evans, Secretary General of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks.
Thanks as well to entrepreneur Jakob Hessler.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Welcome back. From Hania on the Greek island of Crete, economist Yanis Koutsoumidis. And we're also joined from Victoria in British Columbia. He's the former Canadian ambassador to the European Union, Jeremy Kinsman. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. EU trade ministers were supposed to have signed on the dotted line when it comes to this CETA trade deal before the European Council summit that opens Thursday in Brussels and a planned visit next week by the Canadian Prime Minister. Now, all of that is up in the air. Kathy Clifford has more.
Win round Wallonia, move forward with the CETA deal and avoid international embarrassment. The agenda of EU ministers meeting within these walls as activists' qualms quite literally hung over them. For now, no solution but a deadline of this Friday for Belgium to come to an agreement with its Wallonia region, which has become the sole force holding back a deal that was 7 years in the making.
Well, if I didn't think we could solve the Belgian issue, we wouldn't keep on engaging with them, of course. A couple of weeks ago, there were other countries who had some specific problems. So we are engaging with them the same way, trying to see if there are ways we can solve it without, of course, reopening the treaty. That is not even on the agenda. Hopefully we'll get there, but we're not there yet.
The aim behind CETA is to create a common market without customs barriers between the EU and Canada, as well as a reduction in administrative costs for businesses and opening up new agricultural markets. If signed, the deal would be the first between the bloc and a G7 country, and the EU fears its failure would call into question its ability to forge other international trade deals. Its failure would hurt Britain too, with many seeing it as a potential model for the UK's post-Brexit ties. Critics say the deal would give multinational companies greater power than national governments.
It's a regressive 20th century deal that we think is going to end up in job losses. It's going to reduce democracy in Europe and Canada. And so we'd like them to rethink this deal.
The protest movement's current hero, Paul Magnette, head of government in Belgium's Wallonia region. He's described disguised threats for him to approve the deal and said he wouldn't give way. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is left wondering whether to pack his cases, with officials saying his trip to sign the deal at the end of the month won't go ahead unless Belgium can come to an agreement.
All right, and here's what, when the French Prime Minister was in Ottawa last week, Justin Trudeau said, he told reporters, if Europe cannot manage to sign this agreement, that sends a very clear message, not just to Europeans, but to the whole world, that Europe is choosing a path that is not productive, either for its citizens or for the world, and that would be a shame. John Evans, your reaction to that?
I agree with Prime Minister Trudeau on most issues, but on that I think he's wrong. I think the problem with the CETA agreement is that it's not so much about trade, and certainly the organisations I represent certainly are for trade agreements, but it's basically about, as was said in the reporting, giving companies new powers, dealing with the regulation which may be necessary to have a well-functioning economy. So I think it's much more important to get an agreement between Canada and the European Union, which is right, rather than an agreement which is actually seen to give business new powers.
Are you saying there's no rush?
Yeah, I think it's questions. It's a negotiation, and people are taking positions in that negotiation now. I mean, if that's not surprising. But the issue is really to get, particularly in the light of the Brexit negotiations, not simply to say we've got to get another agreement, even if it's a bad agreement, because that shows that people can decide on something, because that'll simply come back as a boomerang. I think the essential thing is to get a well-balanced, good agreement. And I think the fact that the Commission has had to come back in the last few days with a declaration which is supposed to be interpretive guidance on the agreement, which actually deals with many of the criticisms which have been actually presented on the original deal, I think is a sign that the process is shifting. We'll see whether that gets done by Friday morning or whether it will be put off and it requires some months to actually negotiate. But in that case, I don't think that's a drama either.
So I would agree with that. I think first thing, I think the EU was right to give the power back to the member states. It had not the legitimacy to conclude that deal by itself, I think, and they were right to not do that. Secondly, I think I personally think that most of what's in the agreement seems to me quite useful, and from a business perspective, something you would want to ease business with Canada. And we're not talking about sort of tyrannic countries with tyrannic corporations. We're talking about Canada after all. But I think the issue is about how do you negotiate a trade deal, and I think we lack a bit of imagination, because what we've seen with TTIP is if you think...
TTIP is that deal with the United States, which right now is even more up in the air.
So I think if you think that you can, in the 21st century, negotiate a deal secretly over years, and then suddenly in the end present the finally packaged deal and say, now take it or leave it, that doesn't work. And I think the lesson learned is, and you can see in the EU, now the ombudswoman of the EU has opened and created more transparency on TTIP. And I think the only way to go forward is to create much more transparency, A, because people can influence the outcome and they can express preferences in the negotiation. And secondly, you have a much greater legitimacy, because I think in the content of it, most of it, I think most reasonable people could probably agree with, and then, well, let's haggle about the issues that are really tough.
All right, let me bring in Jeremy Kinsman on this. Jeremy, you've heard our panel here in the studio. They say there's a lot they agree with in the agreement with Canada, but it isn't now or never. Do you agree?
You know, we started this in 1972. That was the first trade mission to the Europe of the Six. In response to Richard Nixon's unilateral imposition of a 10% surcharge on imports, which hurt us very badly, we started in 1972. We couldn't negotiate with the Europeans because they couldn't get an act together. In this particular case, it was because France, still in the shadow of Charles de Gaulle, who died, couldn't authorize Brussels to conduct relationships with other countries. That was foreign policy, which stayed in the hands of the member states. Now we're in a position where it is the regional government of Wallonia that is deciding that the 27 countries, minus, of course, Britain, can't conclude what is a deal with Canada which bears no resemblance to the description that was given by your first panelist. This isn't a corporate deal. This is a people-to-people deal. This is a 21st century agreement. It's not about goods. It's about attempting to find a way that two highly integrated already by investment economies can also find ways to enable people to go back and forth, professionals, workers, students, scholars, and work in the other country's jurisdiction without being subject to a whole bunch of protectionist and guild exclusions that disqualify them from being an architect or a doctor or an accountant because their courses weren't undertaken in exactly the same way as other courses. It's not about corporations. It's about Canada and Europe trying to find a way to work better together, to give virtual recognition to each other's credentials on a basis of equivalency. Of course, it also deals with the regulatory environments. Regulations are extremely important, obviously, and they affect investors. We've made it repeatedly clear that we absolutely respect the right of local jurisdictions to elaborate their own regulations to ensure that they support labor standards, environmental standards.
All right, but then
health
in that case, tell me about this court of arbitration, which has been one of the big sticking points and has raised red flags. And by the way, a similar court of arbitration is one of the main reasons why there's such blowback against a trade deal between the EU and the United States.
First of all, Canada is not the United States, okay? Let's get this clear. If you have problems of doing a deal with the United States, then deal with the United States. This is very, very different. There has to be some kind of a panel to arbitrate obvious conflicts in the event of a government being elected to replace a previous government. Let's say the new government decides there won't be any more pipelines. A previous government had authorized pipelines. Therefore, a previous investor had built a pipeline. That investor built a pipeline with a view, obviously, to expecting that it was going to endure. Now it doesn't endure. So to what extent is that investor entitled to some compensation? I think by customary law anywhere, that's a very reasonable process to have. So how do you do it? You get some neutral panelists, judicial panelists, and you assign them to the case to come up with a compromise solution. I mean, that is something that is done throughout commercial law and throughout customary human law.
All right, let me bring in on that point Yanis Koutsoumidis, who's with us from Hania. Yanis, your thoughts on this? I know this is one of the things that Germany's highest court is looking at in great detail.
Exactly, because the solution, this tribunal that has been agreed, is a hybrid. There's no such thing in Europe. In Europe, we have the European Court of Justice, we have the courts in Brussels and Luxembourg. So this is a new thing that's coming into play. What I think the best solution would be, but I don't think there is time right now to change the whole thing. The best solution, and we have to see it in the future, because we might expect a similar agreement for Great Britain. I don't think that's out of the question that the UK will deliver a hard Brexit and there will be a free trade agreement with the UK as well. So there has to be established an independent court, like court of arbitrations, which is, I think it's based in Paris, a similar court of trade court between the European Union and the countries that having a free trade agreement with the European Union. And that would be more authority given to this court rather to a panel or a tribunal. I think this is a sensitive case, but I think the agreement is open-ended. This is something that can be developed in good faith, in goodwill, in coming months or coming years.
So what's your religion on what's your religion, Yanis, on signing now or later?
I think now it's a momentum is to reach an agreement in the next 36 hours. I don't think there is a political patience in many capitals. Also, Prime Minister Trudeau gave a very, very passionate speech in the past few days saying Europe has to deliver on its promises. I think we will disappoint many of our trade partners around the world if we keep kicking the can down the road and keep changing all the agreements that we make with the governments.
John Evans?
Yeah, the problem is we're talking about this if it's a trade agreement. It's not a trade agreement. I think it's an investment agreement. It's a regulation agreement. Now, certainly, why do we have to have a special arbitration system when an individual citizen can't actually go to some supranational court and challenge a decision? Why can't a union go and actually raise questions of fundamental labour rights being violated? Why should companies have that right? And why, in many cases, on bilateral investment dispute settlements, it's actually used as a chilling effect on the questions of raising a minimum wage, compensation of environmental regulations. I think there's two other problems with this agreement. which are fundamental. One is also the question of the limits to regulation this could put into place and what's meant by the precautionary principle, which the Commission itself has had to try to explain in this subsequent declaration. And the other one is what is actually the area of the public sector. There's a great deal of concern that public service could be under attack in the agreement. Now, just because Canada is a nice country, and we all feel that Justin Trudeau's doing a good job, doesn't mean to say we've got to get into a bad agreement where the investment chapter would last for 20 years if this goes through. So I think those three things have to be changed. The Commission declaration, which was just introduced a few days ago, tried to give explanations on all three of those issues. If there wasn't a problem, why did they feel they had to do that? They're clearly actually reacting to the pressures and the criticism. The issue now is what is the legal status? What is the legal status of that document in the future? And I think
Jeremy
that's the
Kinsman.
key question.
Well, there's a problem, and the speaker is the problem. I mean, he's speaking from a position of doctrine and ideology, which really doesn't have anything to do with Canada and Europe. I mean, I will hazard our environmental regulations, our minimum wage, our social conscience, our social contract is every bit as robust as
we're talking about three issues in the agreement, which will then be a blueprint for all future agreements. There's not an international trade or investment agreement in Europe which has got investor-to-state arbitration in it. And I think that's absolutely toxic. That's toxic.
But there are many of those. There are many of those agreements in place today. There are many of these agreements in place. I think that the first one was Germany and Pakistan.
But they're bilateral. They're not multilateral.
There are multilateral one. There's the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a multilateral treaty. I think the key issue is that as suddenly Western states have become not only the claimant, but suddenly the defender, they suddenly feel that a system that they were very happy to impose on developing countries, i.e. you go to Kazakhstan and it doesn't work, so let's better have an arbitration tribunal, which of course is more neutral than having to go to a court in Kazakhstan, or if you go in your court in New York or in Toronto or in Paris, you're never going to get your money. So the fact is, I think it's not about the individual laws. I agree with Mr. Klinsmann. I think the issue about this arbitration court is about the transparency and about the myth that are ranking around because it is secret, it has a non-recourse action, which all has a number of real advantages, but it has the problem of a perceived lack of democratic legitimacy because it binds governments.
Legitimacy at the heart of it. When we come back in the France 24 debate, we're going to talk about the legitimacy for the EU as it struggles in this post-Brexit world. You're watching the France 24 debate.